Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the EPC Talks Geopolitics. My name is David O'Sullivan, and I'm the chairman of the governing board of the EPC. And I'm very honored and also very pleased to have as our guest this morning, the Right Honorable Catherine Ashton. Cathy was the European Union's first High Representative for foreign affairs and security policy when the Lisbon Treaty was created that post in 2009. She had the responsibility of creating the European External Action Service, in which I played a modest role. And previously, she had served as the first British female commissioner for trade in the European Commission. She was a life peer in the House of Lords. She's a former nominee for the Nobel Peace Prize, among other accolades, and she is a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington. Welcome, Cathy, and thank you for joining us. And we look forward to hearing your views on a range of topics. Let me start with the relations between the UK and the EU, which as a former commissioner, as a former high representative, I'm sure you follow closely. The relations have been strained. The Brexit negotiations were tough, both on the withdrawal agreement, then the trade agreement. We have a lot of tension over the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is still continuing. I'm very sorry, my printer has decided to clean itself. I can't switch it off. I apologize for the background noise. And there has been, tensions with France over fisheries and so forth. But more importantly, I think it seems as though this UK government doesn't really want to engage with the European Union as such on issues where we would have a lot in common, such as foreign policy and so forth. So how do you see this playing out?
Well, first of all, David, it's wonderful to be here with you. And I want to just say to the audience, there's no way that you can describe your contribution as modest. Without you, there would be no External Action Service. Without you, there would be no way in which Europe is able to engage with the world on foreign policy. I leave it there, but without you, that would be true. We're in a sort of strange world of the immediate post-Brexit relationship and the residual effect of those within Britain who felt passionately and strongly that any kind of formal relationship with Europe was a bad thing. That still plays into a government that is looking to begin, at least, I think, the relationship of the future. A combination. Those within the government feel very strongly that they don't want to be tied to Europe, combined with, as I've said, this residual effect, combined with really a sense here that there isn't a direction of travel. There's no obvious way forward. There are lots of ideas out there, but none of the political parties really have put forward a structured plan for what the relationship might look like, neither economically nor politically. And you're absolutely right. When it comes to issues of foreign policy, close partnership with Europe is going to be essential. Indeed, last night, over the subject of Ukraine, when President Biden was talking to European leaders, he was talking to the President of the Commission and the Council, he was talking to leaders in Italy and Germany, and also in the UK. So from a transatlantic perspective, which I know we'll come on to, there is a real need for Britain to be engaging with Europe in order for that relationship to also be as effective as it possibly can. So in the longer term, I think what we'll find is, as politics settles down here, and if you like, settles down over in France post-election, as we start to imagine a world where Britain has got to play and will want to play a role in issues of foreign policy and security, my ambition, my hope, my belief is that we will start to move closer to establishing better links with the EU, as we should.
Do you have any advice for the EU? I mean, we know the difficulty on the UK side, and frankly, here in Brussels, I think people are a little despairing of how to manage a better relationship with this particular government, given all the points that you've just made. But Do you think that there are things we could be doing differently, or is there a way of approaching this that from the European side that might lead to a better outcome, or do we simply have to wait for the kind of dust to settle in London before the conditions are ripe for going forward?
I think Maros Sefcovic, who I've got enormous admiration and respect for, is the right person to be now in debate with Liz Truss, who's, as you know, the new Foreign Secretary. Look, I think the advice is to keep going in terms of trying to find solutions. I think we've moved away now from some of the worst rhetoric that was damaging, especially coming from the UK side, but not exclusively. And now it's about, let's get down to some practicalities. I know there are still huge issues, and you and I know only too well the challenges with the Northern Ireland Protocol, with trying to work out how that relationship is going to be successful in the future, bearing in mind the dangers of damaging the Good Friday Agreement. But I think we now have to, in a sense, say to everybody, let's just calm down, let's just sit down and try and work out what will happen. And today in Brussels, I think Maros Sefcovic and Liz Truss meet again. And my hope is, and my advice would be, just let's try and keep this about the rhetoric of success rather than trying to exploit the differences all the time.
Thank you. You already touched on the transatlantic relationship, which I know you attach a lot of importance and you worked very hard, particularly on the Iran dossier with the US. We'll come back to Iran in a moment. Obviously, Trump was a major shock to the system on so many levels. Great relief with the arrival of President Biden. Probably the most pro-European team around him that I think we've ever seen in American policy circles, starting in the White House through to the State Department. Many names that you know, like Tony Blinken, Wendy Sherman, Victoria Nuland, Amanda Sloat in the White House. Fantastic team. And yet, it hasn't gone quite as smoothly as we all hoped. We've had, a number of slip-ups with the vaccine patent issue, with AUKUS, with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. How do you see the transatlantic relationship, bearing in mind the enormous domestic constraints which this administration faces, and indeed maybe even the possibility of an unhelpful outcome in the midterms in November? How do you see that?
Well, America's really important, and an America that's not fully engaged is better than an America that's not engaged. Okay, so we work with what we've got. But you and I will remember when President Obama made his pivot to Asia kind of move, and the feeling in parts of Europe that somehow we were going to be forgotten, that we were going to be left behind, that this was about a president who didn't understand the vital nature of the transatlantic relationship. Now, people can argue about whether he did or he didn't, but the interpretation that I think is really important to put on all of this is that this is an opportunity for Europe to be able to develop for itself what it wants to do and be in the context of foreign policy and security for the longer term. When we started looking at the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue, David, and again, you'll remember this from our time together, part of the reason that was important, and part of the reason the Western Balkans, as a piece of work, if you like, as opposed to an obvious group of nations to be part of the EU, why that was so important to us was because we saw it as an area of work where Europe definitely should be in the lead, and where we needed American support, but in a sense, we could actually take the initiative, and we did. And we took that initiative and we did it with American support, but there's no question that it was a European initiative. And I wanted to do that for all sorts of reasons, but one of the reasons was to show that Europe was capable of being a foreign policy actor, player in its own right, and to show the US that they could rely on the Europeans to actually try and tackle some of the issues themselves. Now, I still believe that that is true, that there are places where Europe is able to engage and to play a particular role, it's most often in collaboration with the US. Sometimes they lead, sometimes we are actually at the front trying to kind of maneuver or move an issue forward. And that was a case in point. So wherever the Biden administration is, it's still about trying to find the right role for Europe and making sure that Europe has developed a good and strong and forward-looking foreign policy and security strategy. So America is there. It may not be perfect. I'm not sure it ever was. Even when people look back, you know, there's always been a sense of the US is obviously operating within its own interests, and Europe was always part of those interests. But it's always going to be the case that an American administration is going to be focused on domestic issues and focused on interests that are much broader and wider. So the question really is for Europe is, how do we make sure that it works as well as it possibly can? And where does Europe come into this? How does Europe actually develop its own policies sufficiently that it can lead on occasion?
So you have some sympathy for a form of strategic autonomy then, but strategic autonomy, but not strategic isolation from the US.
I love these kind of phrases because I never quite know what they mean, and they seem to mean different things to different people. I learned early on, the minute you say oh yes to anything, you've kind of lined yourself up with a whole bunch of stuff you didn't know about.
Right.
So I think what I'm saying is that it's much, for me, it's much more about, you know, Europe has a responsibility in its own neighborhood and a responsibility to itself to create the conditions where it can be engaged, it can be active. A lot of economic issues where Europe as this massive economic power can play a big part. And in its neighborhood, both south and east, that was something that when we developed the External Action Service, we were very keen to do. And that sits consistently with a US position, but it is in its own way uniquely European too.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Before I pass to the next question, which I'd like to get your views on Iran, I just note for the interests of our participants that there are two ways you can ask a question, and we will leave time for questions directly, either in the chat or in the Q&A widget, which I see somebody has already used, or you can raise your hand if someone wants to actually come on screen live and ask Kathy a question directly. So you can take your choice for that. So Kathy, turning to Iran, and obviously you were hugely instrumental in taking that whole process forward. Finally, under Federica Mogherini, the deal was reached. It was a major triumph of diplomacy, of European diplomacy. And then it all turned very sour when President Trump took America out of the deal, and things seem to have gone downhill since then. Everyone is now trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, valiantly, but with what looks like a perhaps understandable, but nonetheless a much tougher position from Iran, we always thought Iran didn't really want to get a nuclear weapon, but they've certainly ramped up the enrichment, and they are not rushing into a new deal, perhaps again, understandably fearing that any new deal would be reneged upon by a future US administration. What's your take on the whole thing, and what do you think are the prospects for putting it all back together again?
It was always, as you know, a really challenging agreement to reach. I spent 4.5 years on it. I neither started it nor ended it, though I came pretty close to the end. And as you say, Federica, with the team, so got it over the line. I think the element of it that was always a challenge was an understanding that the US position could change because of the nature of the processes in the US. This was going to be about the president. And I do recall that during the many, many long hours of discussions that I had with the Iranian team on my own, they would from time to time raise the point that when you looked at the candidates for the Republican nomination, this was long before there was an idea of a President Trump, really. He was merely one of, I think, 16 at that time.
Yes.
I think 15 of the 16 said they would either review or rip it up. So there was already a concern, I think, right the way through. The ambition and the hope was, if the deal was good enough, why would anybody rip it up? The deal did what it said it would do on the tin or on the can. You know, it could give confidence to everyone that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon. The problem that you've now got is that, first of all, from an Iranian perspective, you have a different government. The government that actually produced the agreement was constantly under fire back home by people saying the Americans will renege on you, you can't trust them. And sure enough, if you like, that's what happened in their eyes. So you have a different government with a different set of priorities and with a much more skeptical view at best, at worst, a much more hostile view of the US and of the, if you like, the West in general. So you're not dealing with the same people, you're not dealing with the same situation. That's the first thing. So this is a different negotiation from that point of view. The second is that many of the additional issues that people felt were really important have kind of crept into the discussion as well. We were very clear throughout that this was not a deal that was meant to tackle all of the other problems that people had with Iran, whether that was within the region, whether that was within the country. It was not going to tackle the death penalty, human rights, its relationships with the Arab nations around it, nor indeed, of course, with Israel. It was not about that. It was simply about what I described often as removing the boulder from the doorway, which was, if they were going to build a nuclear weapon, that was the most important issue to resolve, from which, once that was removed from the doorway, you could go in and tackle, one way or another, all of the other issues, or at least begin to. And the challenge was always for, particularly in America, was people felt that that was not right, that you should add in other things. So you've now got lots of other issues that are being talked about. Yesterday, there was a discussion about the release of people from prison in Iran, Americans who were held in prison, and whether Rob Malley, who's been leading, who's an excellent person, you know, is sort of trying to deal with that as well. I'm not saying whether he should or he shouldn't, but these are issues that go beyond. So the prospects are not great. Iran is highly skeptical, I'm sure, about the US. The US is dealing with a different regime that is not perhaps looking for the things that Rouhani was in terms of the relationship of the future. This is a regime, I know the chief negotiator of it, but I don't know the politicians around it. The Europeans are working incredibly hard to try and bridge the gap. And it is important because it's also where the Russians and Chinese are working with the Europeans and Americans. And there are very few, frankly, places where you can say that's the case. But I think it's quite difficult to see where this comes out. It may be, and I know this is something that's been talked about, that you need to look for a series of smaller agreements, rather like the interim agreement we did, which will take the edge off the fear and the timetables, but actually will allow you to kind of build up to a bigger and broader agreement. But we'll have to see whether that's the case.
If my memory serves me well, the decision to focus exclusively on the nuclear issue in a first phase was actually something on the sort of, if you like, the non-Iranian side. It was what the Americans, the Europeans, and even the Russians and the Chinese wanted to avoid having to make trade-offs between other issues and the nuclear.
Yeah.
Do you think that the negotiations are now irreversibly polluted by the whole thing, you know?
No, I don't think they are, because I mean, the other reason that the other countries didn't want to have other issues was because we didn't actually all agree on the other issues.
Right.
I mean, this was the permanent members of the Security Council, the P5, who nowadays agree on little, but did agree on this. And keeping it absolutely about that meant that you stuck firmly to an area where there was massive agreement and where they all played their part. And I've said this a million times, that at various points, each country was crucial to actually keeping things moving, keeping things going forward. It wasn't just an American or just European. The Russians and Chinese played their part too. It's not that I think it's irretrievably polluted. I just think that the minute that you kind of took away the framework of the agreement, and of course the US engagement with it, it then sort of dissolves into a place where people can kind of add in what they think is going to be important. And it was meant to be the first agreement, not the last. It was never meant to be the agreement that will solve all the problems. And so by failing to build on it, what you've done is sort of remove the foundations of a future set of agreements that come forward, which means you're automatically, in a sense, having to examine issues that have become more prominent and more concerning in that period of time.
Yeah, I mean, I know that people really tried their best to persuade President Trump and particularly President Macron, Chancellor Merkel, not to pull the plug. It really was, I think, one of the most damaging things I think he actually did in terms of global interests. But we are where we are, and we wish them, the teams, good luck with trying to put this back together. You mentioned Russia and China, and obviously that brings us then to that broad set of issues. I mean, the rise of China is clearly, the big question of the 21st century. Biden clearly has made this a priority, dealing with China, mobilizing to deal with China, and then suddenly, and a sense, I used to say, when I was talking about these issues in the US, well, the Americans are focusing on China and Asia because Europe is no longer a problem, right? Europe was a kind of solved issue, and boom, now we have 100,000 Russian troops on the frontiers of Ukraine, people talking again of possible war in Europe, which almost unthinkable. Watching the Netflix movie about Munich last night was sobering. I mean, I'm not drawing any direct analogies for one moment, but to think that we are actually contemplating the prospect of a war in Europe is almost unimaginable. I mean, obviously we had the Balkans and the horrors there, but still this would be on a different scale, I think. So what's your take? Let's take Russia first, and then maybe try to take a little bit of time on China. What's your take on the present situation? Is the West getting it right? Is there a diplomatic off-ramp?
I think it's really alarming to see what's happening. And there's a lot of analysis going on as to how we got here. Most of it starts with the end of the Cold War and the sense that a defeated Russia didn't really find a place in a post-Cold War world. Lots of grievances that you and I have listened to from Russian delegations over the years, including at summits with President Putin or with meetings with Foreign Minister Lavrov and others, about promises that were made about the future of NATO and the growth of NATO and how that's not been kept, and so on. So there's a lot of grievance mixed into this in some ways, and a lot of excuses, like greater military aid coming into Ukraine or whatever, to justify. And it's very difficult to read what the end game actually would be. Arguably, part of what I think Russia would like to see is this bilateral relationship with the US, excluding Europe, where it's seen to be the obvious partner in dealing with issues that affect the broader continent of Europe or the broader landmass of Europe, and that these two parties will sit down together and discuss it. That's been one of the objectives, and the weakening, therefore, as they would see it, as the Russians would see it, of Europe in not being able to play that role. So it's really, really important that Europe does play that role. Really, really important that it engages as much as it possibly can, and really important that it stands together on this. It doesn't mean there aren't a variety of different views and relationships with Russia, from those who live very close by to those who live furthest away. That's always been the case on every foreign policy issue. You have countries who have very different perspectives, but the point about the European Union's Foreign Affairs Committee, the point about coming together is that people recognise the need to stand together on issues that may not be the top of their priority list, but they also know that when we get to their priority list, they will be supported by those for whom their priorities perhaps are not top of the list. So it's really important. So you've got all of these things going on, and a question that we can't answer is what actually will happen next. Will there be an attempt to take part of the land? Will there be an attempt to do something, as the British were reporting, changing the government in Kiev, though that's a more complicated process with the Rada and so on. All of that. It's very, very difficult to see how it comes out. What needs to happen is all the diplomatic tools have to be used, all the pressure points have to be pushed. The clarity of what will happen should an incursion take place, should an invasion take place, needs to be there. So the calculations to be made are real ones. And the sense of a strong coming together of a European position will all aid and help that, which I think is what is currently underway. But it's difficult to see in the end where this is going, except that it fits into a broader sense of Russia's grievances of the past linked to some of the feeling about the future of Ukraine.
Yeah, it's, we were together in Vilnius at the famous summit when this all started to come unstuck.
Yeah.
And, the rest is history. Yanukovych refusing to sign, the Maidan protests, and then his ultimate flight leading to the annexation of Crimea. So it goes back a way, as you say. Do you think, the challenge for the Europeans, of course, is, the Americans rightly say we need to prepare a very strong response in the event of an invasion. Of course, we've ruled out a military response, right, which is probably wise, but it already is one signal. Then you fall back on, well, let's have very tough sanctions. Of course, some Europeans would say, well, yeah, very easy for the Americans to be great advocates of strong sanctions. The one who pay the economic price will be the Europeans, and I think there's a difficult discussion going on in Europe about the trade-off between the need for a very strong response, whether that is Nord Stream 2 or SWIFT or whatever, and the recognition that almost any very tough sanctions will come at quite a high economic price for a number of our member states.
Yeah,
this is not an easy discussion.
No, and I remember, David, it wasn't when we had the discussion, when we were dealing with post the taking of Crimea.
Yeah.
And one of the things I recall talking to the US about was getting them to understand two realities. One is the implications of sanctions for some of the economies of EU member states were quite high. And governments are not always as secure as, looking from the outside, they may appear, or indeed, we know that they're not very secure. So you have coalitions that can collapse at any minute. And if you have people feeling that the economy is suffering because of a problem over there, and that is not understood well, and that you've got those who will politically play into that, you can have governments start to change or start to collapse because of something that you do. You have to take people with you. And then you get a position where governments come in who are not keen to do sanctions at all, or in some circumstances. And then you're not allowed to, you're not allowed to deal with things in a way that you would wish in the future, because you don't get that unanimity, which is what makes it so special. So it is important, I think, first of all, that European countries understand the consequences of the sanctions they're taking. And the Commission used to do some great work on analysing what would happen and looking at ways to mitigate that. But secondly, that the US understands that getting a strong common European response, a unanimous response to it, is really important. It's important economically, but it's important as a political signal. And three, that the explanation of why this matters so much to the people of Europe needs to be clear, so that you don't get the backlash of people feeling that their jobs are at risk, or that they're not able to do things that they did in terms of their business before because of the sanctions, that they understand what that is, and mitigating that as far as possible. So it is different, and it is very different to the kind of US being able to take sanctions, which often have less economic impact than, of course, they do in Europe.
Yeah, very, 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 very difficult situation. As you say, we can't predict how it's going to play out. Turning to China, because I think we couldn't talk geopolitics without mentioning that. Obviously, the rise of China is the big question, an existential issue perhaps for the US, because China makes no secret about wanting to challenge America's sort of post-collapse of the USSR as a sort of unipolar hegemon. Therefore, there is clearly a slightly different perspective from the US point of view. From a European perspective, we share many of the criticisms, share many of the concerns. On the other hand, we would like to keep good relations. Do you think Europe is getting that balance right? Are we leaning towards too much accommodation with China? How do you, and the other point I would make is that China isn't its own best friend these days. I mean, the behavior towards Lithuania, which is obviously completely unacceptable, the very excessive reaction to the relatively modest sanctions over the human rights issues with the Uyghurs, is not making them many friends just at the moment in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, I think there are two things that strike me. One is nobody's really got a completely worked out China policy yet. And that's not necessarily a criticism, it's a fact. It's just everybody's trying to work out what to do about this extraordinary economy that has huge reach and impact on everyone, and that is a global power in that context, with growing expenditure on military, that has raised a whole range of issues, both domestically and within its own region, that have caused great concern. But I think there's still a sense that there isn't a European strategy for what that would mean, for exactly the reasons that you've given. On the one hand, the economic links with China are very important and so on. And on the other hand, there is great political concern about what's happening inside the country with the Uyghurs and others, and also whether China's actually telling us what its ambitions really are within its own region. So I think we're still in the kind of the early or middle stages of trying to work that out, and that's not a surprise to me at all. And I think from the Chinese perspective, yeah, their reaction to things that they may not like, but are about nations making their own decisions about who they relate to, is not going to win them friends, and is going to, in a sense, set the views of how people believe they'll react if things get more difficult. My personal view is that we need to work out very carefully, and this was true of the NATO review as well, is, you know, China is an issue as well as a country. It's something that needs to be thought about, but it needs to be thought about, you know, looking at all of the different elements of the relationship and recognizing that China is not going away. It's here. It's got a very strong economic reach now, with what it's been doing in terms of outreach to countries across the world, with what was the One Belt, One Road initiative and all of that, hugely significant too. So it needs to be thought about in every dimension, what its relationships are in terms of engagement with the UN, what its relationships are in terms of engagement with Europe, with the US, with the region, and so on.
I mean, obviously both China and Russia are trying to play the divide and rule card with Europe. By the way, America has done this too at times. So it's, we are fair game as we are constituted with 27 member states with very different interests and so forth. Everyone is tempted to play that card. And it has had greater or lesser success, both for Russia and for China. But do you think there's a paradox in the present situation, that what is happening with both Russia and China slightly toughening their approach and frankly being much more muscular in their behavior? Do you think that could paradoxically bring about a sort of paradigm shift in the way Europeans think about these issues going forward? I mean, Helmut Schmidt famously was asked, would it take a common enemy for Europe to integrate? And his reply was, how many of them do you think we need? Do you think that a small silver lining in the many clouds we've been talking about might be that people wake up to the fact that actually Europe has to take these issues seriously, and if we don't work together, we will be picked off one by one?
It was always, when we were dealing with foreign ministers and ambassadors, it was always part of the narrative that we would say to them, is that by standing together, there was a much greater opportunity to achieve something positive for everybody. And that while individual nations needed and wanted their own strong relationships, in some cases with Russia, in other cases with China, or sometimes both, that was not a substitute for developing a stronger collaborative relationship as well. And it goes back to what I was saying about, you have to think about this in every aspect, because there are elements of the bilateral relationships that countries will always have with other countries that are distinct and different and to do with history or economics or geography or something. And it's very hard to get in the middle of that and try and disrupt it in a way. So what you have to do is kind of build on it and actually say, okay, you want to have a strong economic relationship with China, well, so does Europe. Europe would value that if we can get that right. But it can't come at the expense of them being able to behave to another country within Europe in a particular way. It's got to come as a group working together. And yeah, 16+1 or 17+1, the Chinese did that. They were not at all unique in doing that. Exactly as you say, David, it's happened before. And you still have countries that have a stronger relationship with the US. The US doesn't bring everybody at the same time. It chooses its countries, and so on. And we always manage that. I think the key thing should be that the role in Brussels of all of this is to accept and manage those, but to be building on the specific ways in which we say, okay, this and this and this is where we stand. We're not moving on this. This is our view on these issues. This is what we want economics to look like. This is what we think about the politics. This is what our relationship should be. And having that as a framework in which you're not trying to prevent the bilateral discussions, because you never could, in my view, but you are framing them in a way that actually gives them a sense of what they should and shouldn't do, perhaps the parameters.
I think that's absolutely right. And in this context, of course, in my experience, the triangulation between the UK, Germany, and France was always the key to success, because if you built that triangle, 99% of member states found themselves inside it, right? Very occasionally, you might have one outlier for one reason. The departure of the UK has obviously left us with a two-sided triangle, if you see what I mean. But it is probably in this area more than any that the loss of the UK is felt. I have a question, and that's why I'd like to we've just got a few minutes left, from Richard Corbett, who you will remember. Yeah. Richard asks, given that the political declaration attached to the UK withdrawal agreement committed both sides to agree a mechanism for cooperation in foreign policy and security, and that this did not then happen, do you think this is just a factor of Boris Johnson, or might a new a new prime minister or a new government reverse his reluctance to act on that agreement? I've slightly paraphrased Richard's question, actually, but I'm sure he'll forgive me.
It's lovely that Richard's joined us, but this has to happen. I mean, from the perspective of Britain, it needs to have a strong foreign policy relationship with its closest allies, physically closest in many ways, and the relationship with France on defence or with Germany on economics has always been a key part. And as you say, the triumvirate, when I was High Representative, you kind of looked at where the triumvirate were as your starting point. That was not to exclude nor to downplay the importance of other countries, because in some contexts, actually, it was other countries' views that really mattered on an issue more than those three. But where those three were on many things kind of gave you a sense of what the stability, I used to call it the kind of where the middle of the seesaw might be. And in a European context, if I just leave aside the European Union, that surely has to become where we head to. We are in this aftermath, the waves are still washing up. It's still rocky, but as the seas get calmer, I think this will become a key part of where Britain has to look to its future. And it will be, I'm sure, encouraged from across the Atlantic.
But there is still, amongst the many Brexit illusions, the illusion of global Britain, and that actually Brexit empowers the UK to now be a global actor in a way that was not possible when it was in the EU. I suspect you might not entirely share that perspective, but it has some hold on kind of British consciousness. How long before it wears off?
Well, I think it's a lovely phrase, global Europe, global Britain. I talk about global Europe quite a lot when I'm doing things at Woodrow Wilson, but you've got to work out what that actually means, because as an individual nation, you can't do everything. We were able to project a lot of what we felt was important through the European Union. There was no question, and again, you'll recall this, that Britain led on some issues. It was very much engaged on Afghanistan. It was very interested in what happened with Pakistan, for its own particular reasons, of course, as well. But it did have very strong views, and it projected those and got support and helped, in a sense, the development of European policy through that. On its own, it's still going to rely on need to be able to project the same thing. And the idea that it can engage on every single issue is not going to happen. So one of the questions that I've asked is, what do we mean by global Britain? Is it going to be a scattergun of trying to do something in as many places as possible? Is it going to be a very targeted approach, in a sense, to gain a reputation, I don't know, like Norway has, for doing 2 or 3 things, but doing them very well? Or is it going to be somewhere in the middle, which is where I suspect they're thinking, which is to be seen to be a key player, key actor in all of the big issues, hence its engagement on Ukraine, wanting to be seen, not to be absent on the issue of Ukraine, which is what David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, was accused of all those years ago. So, it's very difficult to know where that's going to end up. But to my mind, the projection of what you want through contacts with the European nations is going to be a fundamental part of that. And if we are not in the room anymore, which we're not, influencing policy, then it will be about developing a relationship that means it's engaging fully with all of those nations in order to support policy and strategy from the European Union, and also to push, in a sense, what Britain feels is important too. Well,
I think that's a very upbeat note to end on. I think we all sincerely hope that we will, sooner rather than later, get to that point. Kathy, it's been an absolute treat. Thank you so much for your insights, your capacity to synthesize complex issues. I see you haven't lost touch with the world of foreign policy. Great to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us. We maybe will try and catch up on this another time. In the meantime, best wishes. We haven't seen each other in person for a long time. I hope that COVID permitting, circumstances may change, and we might welcome you back to Brussels at some point. But
it would be very nice. I've only been back to Brussels once since I left, so it'd be very nice to come back again. David, thank you, and again to everybody, thank you for everything that you did. Without you, there wouldn't be anything that we call a foreign policy for Europe.
Okay, thanks a lot, Kathy. Thank you, everyone. We close the session.